I could feel the air thicken the moment I turned the corner and found him alone in the kitchen. The late November sky outside the window bled orange through the blinds, casting long shadows on the marble countertops. He looked up from the coffee pot, startled. I hadn't meant to sneak up, but I wasn't supposed to be there either. He didn't move. Neither did I. The space between us shrank even though our feet stayed planted. The hum of the fridge and a faint Sinatra playing from the living room were the only sounds keeping the moment from collapsing in on itself. I watched his chest rise and fall once. Then again. Then slower. We weren't saying a word, but everything inside me was screaming. Then, he stepped forward. One step. That was it. I opened my mouth, maybe to stop him, maybe not. His breath caught. Mine did too. We were inches away. And then the door slammed. My husband was home. Before I begin the story and tell you how everything really happened, answer this question: do you agree that everyone deserves a second chance after cheating? It started on Thanksgiving week, when the house was already smelling like cinnamon and roasted pecans. I was in the kitchen early that morning, arranging store-bought pies from Trader Joe's onto ceramic plates, pretending I'd baked them. My husband had left before sunrise for his business trip in Denver, another 3-day industry expo that somehow always fell on holidays. I wasn't surprised. He kissed me on the cheek, said you'll manage, and rolled his carry-on out the front door. He didn't know his son was already back in town. I found out when I heard the side door unlock, the door with the broken latch that only locals knew how to finesse. I was still in my robe, hair damp from the shower. When I stepped into the hallway, he was already standing there with his duffel bag and that smile I hadn't seen in a year. I figured it was okay, he said. Didn't want to stay in a hotel again. I smiled back and gestured toward the guest room. We barely spoke that first day. I kept myself busy vacuuming places no one would check, rearranging the mantel decorations, changing the bed sheets in the guest room even though he said he'd do it himself. He spent most of the afternoon in his room, door open, unpacking slowly. I tried not to notice. That evening, I cooked. Real food this time, turkey meatloaf and garlic mashed potatoes. He offered to help. I told him no at first. Then gave in. We stood side by side, peeling potatoes. He told me about work, mentioned his wife, lightly. Said she had to stay behind for meetings. I nodded but didn't ask more. When he laughed, it came out like it didn't know where to go. Remember when I tried to deep fry a Twinkie in the backyard and almost set the grass on fire? He asked. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it pulled something out of me I didn't know I missed. Later that night, I walked past the guest room to grab laundry. The door was cracked open, and he was shirtless, bent over his suitcase. He didn't see me. I didn't linger. But I didn't forget. The next morning, I heard him leave for a jog. I was already up, drinking coffee in the kitchen nook. From the window, I watched him run past the neighbor's white picket fence, earbuds in, hoodie damp with sweat. I hated how long I stared. When he came back, I handed him a glass of orange juice. We talked for 5 minutes. It felt like a full hour. He went to shower. I went to clean the laundry room. That was when I realized something. My husband sent his cologne, it wasn't in the bedroom. Hadn't been for a while. I busied myself with dusting picture frames. In one of them, from 10 Christmases ago, I stood between the two of them, husband and stepson. Both smiling. Both looking toward the future. That evening, I made dinner again. Simple stir-fry and rice. He insisted on helping. In the cramped kitchen, he reached for the soy sauce at the same time I did. Our hands stopped. But neither of us moved. I pulled back first. My heart didn't. The following day, we spent time digging through old boxes in the basement, looking for the ceramic turkey my husband liked to put on the table each year, even if he was never home to enjoy it. He found a photo of his mother. His real mother. She passed away before I entered their lives. He sat on the cold basement floor, holding the frame. I sat beside him. She loved the holidays, he said. I know, I replied. He looked at me, and for a second I thought he would cry. Instead, he smiled, one of those tight, tired smiles people wear when their heart is somewhere else. He touched my hand. Gently. Respectfully. And I didn't pull away. I should have. That night, I couldn't sleep. I cleaned the pantry. Washed the guest towels. Sorted the drawer of batteries and spare chargers. At midnight, I went to the kitchen for water. He was already there. He wore flannel pajama pants and a gray t-shirt. I was barefoot, wrapped in a shawl. He turned. Our eyes met. Neither of us said a word. We stood there, in silence, for what felt like the length of a movie. Then he whispered, "You okay?" I nodded. Too quickly. He stepped toward me, opened his mouth like he had a confession, or maybe a question. Then, just as suddenly, he backed away. "I'll let you rest," he said. And he walked back down the hall. I stayed frozen in place. The next day, as I was ironing linens in the guest room, I found something tucked into the edge of his open suitcase, a plane ticket stub. Dated for the day before. But it wasn't from Chicago. It was from Dallas. And his wife, she wasn't supposed to be in Dallas. I stared at the ticket until the iron scorched a dark patch into the sheet. I stood there for several seconds, staring at the scorched patch on the sheet, the plane ticket stub still in my hand. My heartbeat was no longer steady, it was tapping out its own erratic rhythm, syncing with something deeper I didn't want to admit. Dallas. The word repeated itself in my head like an echo that wouldn't fade. Why lie about that? I tucked the stub back exactly where I'd found it and finished folding the sheet like nothing had happened. But everything had. Or was about to. He came up the stairs just as I stepped out of the room, damp from another jog, shirt clinging to his chest. His eyes caught mine. He nodded casually, like we hadn't stood inches from each other in the kitchen at midnight. Like my thoughts weren't suddenly teetering on a ledge. "You're up early," he said. I forced a smile. Couldn't sleep. He passed me. I kept walking, each step deliberate, controlled, like I could still convince myself none of it mattered. Later, while he showered, I gathered the laundry. I paused outside the bathroom door for a second longer than necessary, just enough to hear the water stop, the handle turn, the towel being pulled from the rack. I moved on. That afternoon, I found him barefoot in the kitchen, organizing the grocery list I'd written and left on the counter. He'd added items. My favorite herbal tea. The almond cookies I only bought during the holidays. We hadn't discussed any of it. I figured we could go to Whole Foods, he said, lifting the list. I hesitated, then nodded. Let me grab my coat. The drive was short, but the silence stretched. The air between us was thick with something we were both too afraid to name. The windshield wipers tapped slow against the glass. My hands clenched the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Inside the store, everything felt too bright. Too exposed. Families passed by with carts full of stuffing mix and cranberries. We moved deliberately, quietly, like two strangers pretending not to know each other's secrets. He reached for the almond cookies without asking. I looked at him longer than I meant to. He noticed. We loaded the car in silence. On the way home, He turned the music up louder than needed. A classic station played something soft from the 80s. I didn't recognize the song, but the lyrics felt uncomfortably fitting. Back at the house, we carried the bags inside. The moment we closed the door behind us, the silence became unbearable. I turned to speak, but he was already standing too close. The distance between us collapsed. We kissed. And just like that, the thread snapped. I pulled away first. We said nothing. The clock above the microwave ticked louder than anything else. I turned and walked to the pantry. Began stacking cans of yams, acting like I hadn't just dismantled something I couldn't rebuild. He stayed behind me, unmoving. That night, we avoided each other. I went to bed early, pretending to be tired. He stayed downstairs, watching a game with the volume low. Around midnight, I heard his footsteps in the hallway. Then silence. The next morning, I found him already dressed, pouring cereal like it was any other day. "I'm gonna help you fold that laundry," he said. I wanted to say no, but I didn't. I couldn't. We stood side by side in the laundry room, folding towels. The quiet wasn't as heavy as before, but it wasn't light either. I dropped one. He bent to pick it up. Our hands met. I stepped back. He straightened up. Our eyes locked. Then we both turned away. In the afternoon, I suggested he help me sort through the storage boxes in the basement, Thanksgiving centerpieces, wreaths, lights. I needed the distraction. I think he did too. We opened boxes we hadn't touched in years. I pulled out a cardboard turkey with a missing wing. He found a tin of candles shaped like pine cones. We laughed, but only a little. Then he reached into one of the deeper bins and pulled out a photo album I didn't recognize. Inside were pictures of his mother. Younger, smiling, free. He sat down on the concrete floor and flipped through slowly, quietly. "She used to play piano every Sunday," he said. "Sometimes just to fill the room." I sat beside him, watching his fingers trace the edges of a photograph. "She liked people who listened more than they talked," he added. I didn't respond. I just looked at the photo. Then at him. "Thank you," he whispered. I knew he wasn't thanking me for the photos. We sat there, unmoving, for what felt like hours. When we stood up, it was already getting dark outside. I made tea. He turned on the lamp in the living room. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, not touching, not speaking. Eventually, he leaned his head back and closed his eyes. I watched him breathe. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I wandered the house, rearranging pillows, wiping non-existent dust from counters, straightening the shoes by the door. Then I opened the junk drawer in the kitchen and saw something new, a folded piece of paper with handwriting I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a list. But as I unfolded it, I realized it wasn't grocery items. It was a page torn from a hotel notepad. A list of dates and times. All recent. All with check marks. And one at the bottom circled twice, Thanksgiving, Omaha. The pen pressure had nearly torn through the paper. I stared at it, not breathing. Then I looked again at the handwriting. It wasn't his. And it definitely wasn't mine. The folded notepad page stayed hidden in my robe pocket as I loaded the dishwasher like nothing had shifted. But something had. It was subtle, like the way a room feels colder after someone exits without saying goodbye. My hands moved on autopilot while my mind clung to those circled words, Thanksgiving, Omaha. A name wasn't listed. But the handwriting didn't belong to either of us. He came into the kitchen just as I finished drying my hands. His expression was unreadable. Or maybe I just didn't want to read it anymore. He poured himself coffee without saying anything, then leaned on the counter, watching the steam rise. I couldn't decide what felt heavier, the silence or the note in my pocket. He offered to go to Walmart to grab firewood and a few other things before the storm rolled in. I nodded. Said I'd make chili for dinner. Before he left, he paused in the doorway and looked back at me. Just for a second. Like he might say something. But he didn't. The sound of the front door shutting felt louder than it should have. I stood still for a long time after that. My hands hovered over the drawer with the note inside, but I didn't open it again. Instead, I went upstairs and changed. Jeans. Boots. Coat. I grabbed my keys and followed him. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I needed to see something for myself. I parked in the far corner of the Walmart lot and waited, engine off, trying to keep my hands from trembling. 5 minutes later, I saw him exit the store, alone, carrying firewood and a paper bag. I nearly laughed at myself. He walked to the truck and pulled out his phone. I watched him look at the screen. Then hesitate. Then pocket it again without calling or texting. He climbed in and drove off. I waited 30 seconds, then followed. He didn't go home. He drove to a diner just off Route 6, the one with the old neon sign that always buzzed louder than necessary. I parked 2 spaces away and waited again. He sat in a booth by the window, ordered coffee. Just coffee. Then opened his phone. He stared at it for a long time. Eventually, he began typing. Then he stopped. Deleted. Tried again. Set the phone down. Picked it back up. I couldn't breathe. He never made a call. Never sent a message. He just sat there, going through invisible arguments with a person who wasn't me. I left before he could see me. Back home, I turned on the radio to drown out the quiet. Christmas music already playing on the local station. Burlives telling me to have a holly jolly holiday. I turned it off. When he returned, he placed the firewood by the fireplace and handed me a new pair of thermal gloves from the bag. They had your size, he said simply. I forced a thank you. The snow started falling around 6. By 7, the house was dim except for the warm light of the lamp in the corner. I stirred the chili. He chopped parsley beside me. The closeness between us felt real again, but tainted. Like it knew it shouldn't exist. We ate in the living room, bowls balanced in our laps. Sinatra played low from the Bluetooth speaker. Outside, the wind whistled around the house like something trying to get in. When he reached for the wine, our fingers brushed again. This time, he didn't look away. The electricity flickered once. Then again. I lit 3 candles just in case. By 8, the power went out completely. He brought more firewood inside, and we sat by the fireplace like we had no choice. Our shadows danced on the walls. I wrapped myself in a throw blanket and watched the flames crawl around the logs. He pulled a blanket over his lap and leaned back on the couch, legs stretched out. Our knees nearly touched. We didn't speak for a long time. Then he asked, "Are you scared of storms?" I shook my head. He nodded slowly. I used to be. When I was a kid. I remember, I said, surprised it slipped out. He looked over at me, and the way he looked made it hard to breathe. I wasn't really scared of the storm, he said after a while. Just the quiet that came with it. I couldn't answer that. Outside, the snow hit harder against the windows. Inside, the air grew thinner with every second we sat in that flickering light. We kissed. It was the kind of kiss that didn't ask for permission but somehow didn't feel wrong in the moment. The kind that shouldn't have happened, but did. Afterward, we didn't move for a long time. The wind howled. The fire crackled. I stared at the dancing shadows on the wall, trying to find shapes that made sense. Eventually, he stood and said he'd bring more blankets from the upstairs closet. I didn't follow. While he was gone, I cleaned the mugs and wiped the counters with slow, deliberate motions. When I turned around, he was there, leaning on the doorframe, a blanket folded in his arms, face unreadable again. We both knew nothing was the same. The next morning, the world was buried under a foot of snow. I stepped outside just long enough to feel the chill bite my skin, then retreated to the kitchen. He was already there, brewing coffee, moving like someone who hadn't slept. We didn't speak. Not out of avoidance, but out of preservation. In the afternoon, I gathered laundry. When I opened the dryer, a shirt tumbled out. Not his. Not mine. Not my husband's either. It was a woman's t-shirt. Fitted. White. On the inside collar, faint but clear, was a name written in blue ink. And it wasn't my name. I held the t-shirt in my hands longer than I should have. It was soft, worn in the way only someone's favorite sleep shirt could be. The tag had faded from too many washes. But the name inside the collar was unmistakable, written in blocky blue letters. A woman's name. Not mine. It was folded into the towels, like it had been washed and dried with the rest of our laundry. As if it belonged here. As if she belonged here. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The silence of the laundry room closed in around me, thick and pressing. I stared at the name again, willing it to mean something else. Wishing it could be explained away. But it couldn't. When I finally stepped into the hallway, I nearly bumped into him. He looked at me, then down at my hands. His expression changed, but just slightly. Barely a flicker. But I caught it. A hesitation. Recognition. I found it in the dryer, I said. My voice was quiet but firm. He nodded. She left it, last time we stayed over. Months ago. I didn't know it was still here. I waited for something else, an apology, a laugh, a shrug. Nothing came. Just silence. Then he turned and walked into the kitchen like we were still pretending this house wasn't on fire. I followed minutes later, pretending nothing happened either. The day passed in motion, but I didn't feel present. I cooked, wiped down counters, organized the pantry again, cleaned the bathroom sink. He went out into the backyard to clear the snow off the deck, chopped more firewood, stacked it near the mudroom. We didn't speak more than we had to. But we hovered around each other like magnets facing the wrong direction, drawn in and repelled, again and again. Around 4, the snow stopped, but the sky stayed the color of unwashed cotton. The roads were covered in frozen slush. He came in, stomped the snow from his boots, and stood at the doorway, shaking the cold out of his jacket. We should get away for a day, he said. Cabin's still there. I looked up from the dish I was scrubbing. What cabin? He tossed his gloves on the radiator. The one we used to go to when I was a kid. Near Fremont. Remember? Of course I remembered. His father had taken him there every other summer when he was younger. They'd fish and eat too many s'mores and sleep in sleeping bags on the screened porch. We could leave early, he said. Beat the next storm. I wiped my hands dry and walked past him without answering. I went upstairs, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the spot where my husband's suitcase had rested days before. By the time I came back down, he had started a fire and packed an overnight bag. I didn't ask what he'd packed. I didn't even look. But I found myself grabbing my own coat. We drove out of the city just after 6. The highways were nearly empty, just long stretches of ice-licked asphalt and yellow lights glowing in the fog. We didn't speak during the drive. The hum of the heater and the low rumble of tires on snow-covered pavement filled the silence. When we arrived, the cabin looked exactly like I remembered. A small A-frame tucked into trees, with a wraparound porch and an old stone chimney. He unlocked the door with a key that had probably sat untouched for years. Inside, it smelled like old cedar and forgotten stories. He lit the fireplace while I stood in the middle of the room, arms crossed. I didn't sit. I didn't take my coat off. Eventually, I moved to the window and looked out into the trees. Snow clung to the branches like static. The world outside looked still, like it had paused just for us. But inside me, nothing was still. He walked over, offered me a mug of tea. I took it without speaking. We sat. Not close. Not far. He spoke first. "Do you regret it?" The question sat between us like a dare. I didn't answer. Instead, I asked, "Do you?" His jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Just looked away. The wind knocked softly at the windows. The fire hissed in the hearth. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Later that night, as we sat cross-legged on the rug beside the fire, he reached for a photo that had been left on the mantel, a faded picture of the lake, probably taken 20 years ago. His thumb brushed against the corner. "I used to think this place was magic," he said. "That anything broken could be fixed here." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But magic wasn't real. Only consequences were. We spent night together. The next morning, the sky was silver and trembling. Light snow had started again, soft and unthreatening. We packed in silence. I wiped the counters while he zipped his bag. He folded the blanket from the couch and placed it back in the cedar chest like a ritual. We left just after sunrise. The roads were clearer, but the silence inside the car was heavier than the snow outside. Halfway back to town, he pulled into a gas station. Said he needed coffee. I stayed in the car. I watched him walk inside, his shoulders hunched against the wind. As I sat there, staring out the windshield, I saw something I wasn't supposed to. Across the parking lot, a dark red sedan pulled in. I didn't recognize the car, but I recognized the woman who stepped out. His wife. She looked around like she was scanning the lot for someone. She wasn't alone. In the back seat, I saw a toddler's car seat. Empty. But not for long. I ducked down in my seat instinctively, heart slamming in my chest so hard it hurt. The red sedan idled no more than 30 feet away. She didn't see me. But she was scanning. Her eyes were searching. I watched her step out of the car in a beige wool coat, her phone clenched tightly in one hand. She glanced toward the gas station door, toward where he was. She was waiting for him. I didn't move. I couldn't. The heater blew warm air across my legs while the rest of me sat frozen. She leaned back into the car briefly, said something to whoever was in the passenger seat, then stood again. The car seat in the back loomed behind her like a question I hadn't prepared for. And then he came out. He stepped through the automatic doors, coffee in hand, and spotted her immediately. His walk slowed but never stopped. She raised her eyebrows at him, like she wasn't surprised. He didn't look confused. Just resigned. She said something. He didn't smile. They spoke for a few moments. I couldn't hear a word, but I didn't need to. The tightness in his posture told me everything. The way she stepped closer, arms still down by her sides, shoulders squared. Not angry. Not affectionate. Just direct. And then he glanced toward my car. I slid lower. He didn't say anything to her, just handed her the coffee, then motioned toward the sedan. She turned and walked back to it, opened the back door, and retrieved a small pink stuffed animal from the floor. A bunny. She held it for a moment, then dropped it into the passenger seat. He stood watching her. I waited. Seconds stretched. Eventually, she got back in the car, pulled the door shut, and sat there. Motionless. He took one last look at the car. Then, with no warning, turned and walked toward mine. I straightened up fast, fumbled with my coat, tried to look like I was reaching for something that didn't exist. But when he opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, neither of us said anything. He set his coffee down and rubbed his palms over his knees. "She followed me," he said finally. I didn't reply. "She wants to talk." I nodded once. "She's staying at her sister's place for now." That's who was with her. The silence in the car was alive, crawling over every inch of me like ivy. "Is the kid?" I stopped myself. "No. Her sister's watching her," he answered quickly, then added, "But yeah. She knows something." He didn't look at me. Neither did I. We didn't speak the rest of the way back. By the time we got home, the sky was clearing. Bright afternoon light glared off the snowbanks, and the house felt too clean, too bright when we walked inside. I stripped off my coat and went straight to the kitchen. The coffee from that morning still sat on the burner. Lukewarm and bitter. He went upstairs. I heard drawers opening. Closets shifting. He was packing. 20 minutes later, he came down with his bag in hand. "I'm going to go talk to her," he said, standing in the doorway like he didn't know what else to say. "Are you coming back?" I asked without emotion. He hesitated, then shook his head once. "I don't think I should." I nodded. That was all. He lingered for a second longer. Then left. The silence that followed felt heavier than any storm. I spent the rest of the day cleaning the living room, scrubbing out the fireplace, laundering sheets. I opened windows to air the place out even though it was barely 30 degrees. I boiled cloves and cinnamon sticks to cover the scent of the past few days. By evening, the sun was sinking. I lit a candle and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and pen, trying to write down a grocery list but ending up scribbling nothing but the word "why" in the margin. That was when the door opened. I expected him. But it wasn't him. It was my husband. He stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, smiling like he hadn't missed a thing. "Surprise," he said, stepping inside and stomping snow off his boots. "Finished early. Figured I'd make it back for dinner." I sat frozen in the chair. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did and ignored it. He walked to me, kissed my forehead, and asked what was for dinner like everything was normal. I mumbled something about chili. He nodded. "Smells good in here," he added, removing his coat. I stood, barely breathing, and walked to the fridge to retrieve something, anything, to buy time. When I opened the door, my reflection looked back at me in the stainless steel surface. I didn't recognize the expression. We cooked together. I chopped onions while he talked about flight delays and Denver weather and the client who wouldn't stop talking about his backyard remodel. I nodded and stirred the pot. Smiled in the right places. Then, as we sat down to eat, he said something that made the floor shift beneath me. "I was thinking," he said between bites, "we should invite him and his wife over for dinner." I looked up. My spoon frozen halfway to my mouth. "Just a little get-together," he continued, oblivious. "It's been too long since we all sat down as a family." I dropped my spoon. It clattered against the bowl, splattering a line of chili across the table. He looked up, surprised. You okay? I nodded too fast. But inside, I wasn't okay. Because the one person who couldn't come to dinner was the one person I couldn't stop thinking about. And now, he'd be sitting across from me. Next to his wife. Across from mine. The idea of that dinner planted itself in my mind like a splinter. I nodded along as my husband spoke, trying to hold my face in something close to pleasant, but my stomach turned cold. He continued talking about dates and menus, what wine to serve, whether we should do something fun like charades after dessert. He was already imagining the whole evening, drawing out the seating plan in his mind. I cleared the table quickly after we finished eating, though I could barely taste anything. My hands moved robotically, scraping plates, rinsing, stacking in the dishwasher. He moved behind me, giving my shoulder a casual squeeze before heading into the living room to put on a game. It might as well have been any other night. To him, it was. But it wasn't. The man he wanted to invite to dinner had kissed me twice. Had spent a night in my arms. Had left without looking back, only to return through my husband's good graces. The next morning, I found him already emailing invitations. Figured we'd do next Friday, he said over his coffee. Gives everyone enough time to shuffle schedules. I didn't respond. The week passed with a strange calm. My husband went back to his usual routine, calls in his home office, long stretches of silence broken by his footsteps going to the kitchen for more coffee, the occasional joke or comment tossed my way. I responded as if everything was normal. But inside, the clock ticked toward the dinner I wasn't ready for. On Wednesday, I went to the grocery store under the excuse of planning a menu. I spent an hour in the produce section, picking up items I didn't need and placing them back. I couldn't focus on flavors, only faces. His face. Her face. My own, reflected in the freezer door. Pale, uncertain. When I returned home, my husband was in the garage reorganizing tools. He looked up and smiled like everything made sense. That night, I sat awake in bed while he snored beside me. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if there was a version of this story where I could be honest. There wasn't. Friday arrived cold and windless. The driveway had been cleared of snow, and the dining table was dressed in cream linens and faux eucalyptus I'd bought from a holiday display at Target. I set 8 places, each fork aligned with care, each wineglass glinting beneath the warm pendant light. At 5:56 p.m., headlights swept across the front window. They were early. I opened the door before my husband could. He was still adjusting his shirt in the mirror when they walked up the steps, both smiling. She wore a soft burgundy sweater and held a small casserole dish covered in foil. He wore a navy pullover, hands in his pockets, eyes landing on me with the briefest pause. "Hi," she said brightly. "Hope we're not too early." "Of course not," I answered. My voice sounded too thin. My husband appeared, pulled them both into hugs, and ushered them in like nothing in the world could be wrong. The house filled quickly with noises, footsteps, laughter, the clinking of dishes, the low hum of music from the living room speaker. She handed me the casserole. "Sweet potato with pecans," she said. "He said it used to be your favorite." I nodded. "Still is." We all moved into the kitchen, the conversation easy on the surface. My husband opened wine. She complimented the centerpiece. He stood near the fridge, close enough for me to smell his cologne, new, different, not the one from last week. Throughout the evening, I watched him. Watched her. Watched them together. The way they touched casually, the way she leaned into him when she laughed. Nothing forced. Nothing overly affectionate. But real. Too real. Dinner passed with smiles and small stories. She talked about her sister's baby. My husband told an old college story. I refilled wine glasses and made sure the bread stayed warm. It wasn't until dessert that something cracked. We were seated around the table with slices of pecan pie. He'd barely touched his. She was mid-sentence about a coworker's holiday party when she glanced at me and asked, "Did you two keep in touch much while I was gone?" The room shifted. Slightly. But I felt it. I smiled carefully. "Not really. Just house things." She looked at him. He was looking at his plate. My husband broke in with a joke. Something about forgetting to take the trash out for 3 days straight. Everyone laughed. But she didn't look away. After coffee, we all moved to the living room. I sat across from them. She curled into his side. He placed a hand lightly on her knee. My husband sat beside me, too far to notice I hadn't blinked in 30 seconds. And then she turned to me and asked the question that shattered the evening like glass on tile. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Her voice was casual, but her eyes weren't. I nodded. "Have you ever felt something for someone you weren't supposed to?" My husband chuckled beside me, thinking it was part of a joke. But I didn't laugh. I looked at her. Then at him. And for the first time since all this began, I told the truth without saying anything at all. She saw it in my face. In his. In the pause. She straightened up. Slowly. Looked at him. Then back at me. I stood. "I'll get more coffee," I said, already moving toward the kitchen. Behind me, the room was quiet. And then I heard her voice. Very calm. Very clear. "I think I'm going to take a walk." She didn't wait for a response. The front door closed behind her. He stood next. I should probably go talk to her. My husband, confused, looked between us. "Is everything okay?" Neither of us answered. He followed her out. I stood in the kitchen, hands shaking, staring at the empty coffee pot. My husband walked in behind me. "Something happen?" he asked. I turned to face him. And at that exact moment, through the front window, I saw her. She was looking in. Watching us. Watching me. She stood just beyond the porch light, framed by frost-tipped glass, watching us like the world had just cracked in half and she wanted to see what would fall through. Her breath was visible in the cold. Her arms were crossed. She didn't move. My husband didn't notice. He was still waiting for an answer I hadn't formed yet. I stepped to the sink, pretending to rinse the empty coffee pot, eyes fixed on the window's reflection. She was still there. Seconds passed. Then she turned and disappeared into the night. I dried my hands and forced myself to breathe. "She's probably just getting some air," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. My husband nodded slowly, his face still puzzled. "Did something happen?" "I don't know," I replied. "Maybe she misunderstood something." He narrowed his eyes but didn't press. Instead, he grabbed a dish towel and started wiping the table. Outside, I heard footsteps on gravel. His. He was chasing after her. Of course he was. I walked to the front door and opened it just in time to see them. She stood at the edge of the driveway, arms still crossed, face turned away. He was talking to her, gesturing lightly, carefully. She didn't say anything. Just stood there, stiff and unmoved. My husband called from the kitchen, asking where the sugar was. I answered without turning around. "Cabinet above the coffee maker." I didn't hear his reply. I was too busy watching her shoulders shake barely, but enough to know she wasn't just cold. He reached for her hand. She let him. Then she turned and walked toward their car. He followed. I stayed by the door. The taillights flared red a minute later. Then the car backed out of the driveway and rolled into the dark. He didn't come back in right away. I waited 5 minutes before going to the mudroom. His boots were still there. The ones he'd brought back from Colorado last year. But his jacket was gone. I returned to the kitchen. My husband was pouring sugar into his coffee like nothing had happened. He glanced at me. "Everything all right out there?" I shrugged. They needed to go. He stirred his cup and didn't press. We sat on the couch and turned the TV on. A sitcom was playing, something bright and loud and completely disconnected from our lives. I kept nodding at the screen, pretending I was listening. He laughed twice. I didn't. At some point, I said I was tired and went upstairs. In the bathroom, I stared at my reflection for too long. There was something brittle in my eyes I didn't recognize. Something hollow. I washed my face with cold water, hoping it would wash away more than it could. In the bedroom, I lay still under the covers, staring at the ceiling while the heater hummed low beneath the floorboards. He didn't come back. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not by noon. And that's when the knock came. It wasn't him. It was her. She stood on the porch again, but this time in daylight, coat zipped, eyes direct. She held a small canvas bag in her left hand. I opened the door. She didn't smile. "Is he here?" she asked. I shook my head. "No." She hesitated. Then handed me the bag. Inside was the pink stuffed bunny I'd seen in the back seat days ago. And next to it, a pair of baby shoes. Tiny. Brand new. I looked up. She met my eyes without blinking. "I wasn't going to say anything," she said quietly. "Not until I was sure." I couldn't speak. But now I am. She turned and walked away. No accusation. No tears. Just truth. And the worst part was, she left the bag. She wanted me to see it. All of it. I stood in the foyer with the canvas bag still in my hand, the weight of it entirely out of proportion to its size. The bunny's fur peeked through the zipper like it didn't belong to either world, hers or mine. I didn't take the shoes out. I didn't have to. I had already seen enough to understand everything she hadn't said. The door was still slightly ajar. I closed it slowly, mechanically, as if that could contain the moment or erase it. Upstairs, my husband moved around, calling out that he'd finished prepping the roast. I didn't respond. I walked to the dining room table and placed the bag beside one of the empty plates. It sat there like evidence. Or maybe just proof that none of this had ever belonged to me. He came down the stairs humming. The smell of herbs and garlic trailed behind him, as if the house itself was trying to maintain some illusion of warmth and safety. He saw me standing still, then noticed the bag. "Someone dropped something off," he asked casually, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. I didn't answer. He stepped closer, looked inside the canvas bag, paused. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A shift. A crack. "She came by," I said. His jaw clenched once, almost imperceptibly. Then he nodded. I waited for more. He didn't give it. I picked up the bag, walked into the hallway, and placed it inside the hall closet without another word. Closed the door gently. He moved into the kitchen, pulled open the oven door, checked the roast. I followed, not because I wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. The table was set. The food was almost ready. The evening was supposed to look like a celebration. A reset. A family dinner. Instead, the house felt like a stage no one wanted to perform on anymore. The doorbell rang just after 6. He opened it with a practiced smile. She stood there alone this time, hair pulled back, face neutral. She carried a small square cake box from the bakery 2 blocks down. The same bakery we all used to walk to after church. She stepped inside without hesitation. They didn't kiss. They didn't hug. She handed him the box, looked around, then looked at me. My husband greeted her with enthusiasm, complimented her coat, told her she looked refreshed. She thanked him, then sat at the far end of the couch like she'd been rehearsing her movements. We made small talk, the 3 of us. Everything was said lightly, but nothing felt light. Every sentence had a second layer buried just beneath the words. I poured wine. She declined. I poured it anyway and left it untouched beside her plate. At the table, he carved the roast while she served the vegetables. I passed the rolls. No one asked for more of anything. We just moved food across our plates like something needed to be filled even if none of us had appetites. Midway through dinner, my husband raised his glass. To family, he said, smiling like he believed it. She clinked her glass to his. I did too, barely touching mine to the rim of theirs. No one drank. She set her napkin on her lap. Then looked directly at me. I've been thinking about what you asked me, she said. I hadn't asked her anything. I didn't speak. I think the answer is yes, she continued. People do feel things they're not supposed to. My husband laughed, thinking it was a philosophical musing. I didn't laugh. Her eyes didn't move from mine. Then she turned to him. I think we should talk, she said. Privately. He looked surprised. Then nodded, wiped his mouth, and followed her into the den. I sat alone at the table. The candles flickered in the silence, casting warped shadows across our plates. I could hear muffled voices. Low, calm. No yelling. Just fragments. Not fair to any of us. I didn't plan any of it. How long were you going to keep pretending? And then I heard nothing. The door opened again. She stepped out first. Walked straight past me without stopping. Took her coat from the hook and put it on slowly, deliberately. He came out second, eyes low, face pale. She opened the door. But before stepping outside, she looked back at me one last time. I'm not the one you should be worried about, she said. Then she left. The door closed behind her with a sound that felt final. He didn't say anything. Just walked to the window and stood there, staring out at nothing. I cleared the plates, stacked them without thinking. The food had gone cold. The wine was still untouched. Then I heard him say it. Soft. Like a breath. She's pregnant. I didn't move. She didn't tell me until tonight. I stared at the sink. She said she wanted me to know before I said anything I couldn't take back. I turned slowly to face him. He looked hollow. I didn't ask the obvious question. He answered it anyway. I don't know if it's mine. The room went silent. And just as I opened my mouth to speak, the front door opened again. But this time, it wasn't her. It was my husband's brother. And behind him was my stepson, carrying his own bag, looking straight at me, like the dinner was just beginning.